We know that all of these so-called archaic Paleo-Indians that have been found and that are ancient are really our ancestors, because we have been living in this area for thousands of years, and these are our ancestral peoples. So we have to work together as the pueblos to come together with a common understanding, a common policy in getting our ancestral remains back in the ground.
The Hopi tribe is technically listed as a Puebloan tribe, but I would like to say that the Pueblos are anything but generic. Indeed, the Hopi tribe, if you look at our social and religious system that we still hold today, is a very complex and diverse group of clans and religious societies. So internally, I can also say that the Hopi tribe is not generic.
As far as the repatriation process, the Zuni tribe is not currently actively pursuing the repatriation of human remains. And this comes about due to cultural reasons.
NAGPRA was given to the Native American people like a one-size-fits-all glove. I think right now all we're trying to do is make that glove fit and work.
Hello, I'm Conroy Chino from Acoma Pueblo. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act is an important piece of federal legislation. But it's also important to understand the tribal perspective on this law, especially here in the Southwest. And that's what we hope to do with this video presentation.
Religious leaders were very disheartened when they hear of sacred objects out in museums, institutions, and they felt that in order for the benefits to not only come to Zuni but throughout the world, to put the world back in harmony, they felt it was very necessary to return the war gods.
When you take certain things, ceremonial objects, religious objects from within their context, then you, in essence, kill a part of the religion, and some of those things need to come back.
For many years, students, curio collectors, art dealers, tourists, and anthropologists bought, traded, and took ceremonial objects important to the southwestern Indian people, the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo. Many of these objects found their way into local and national museums, galleries, private collections, and even into foreign museums where they are treated simply as art objects or Indian relics. In many cases, these artifacts were removed wrongfully or illegally. They were exhibited in poor taste and out of context, and without consideration for the role they played in the culture. Many tribes prior to NAGPRA attempted to recall the religious and ceremonial properties and had asked museums to remove skeletal remains from exhibitions with little or no success.
And archaeologists went and dug up these ancestors of ours and stored them in museums and studied them and things like that. You know, that upset the people, and it kind of fostered some anger and bitterness amongst them.
In November 1990, Congress passed the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. NAGPRA mandates that all American museums, supported by federal funds, inventory their collections of human remains and religious and ceremonial objects and report their holdings to Native American groups. Now that most museums have completed and distributed their inventories to tribes, it is up to the tribes to review and claim, if they choose to do so, their cultural properties. Tribes are not forced to claim, but those who wish to claim can do so under the guidelines of the law. There are no time constraints on the tribes to make their claims. In fact, there has been no rush among most southwestern tribes to repatriate.
The law, as it's written, seems to provide an easy way for tribes to recover cultural properties from museums. But here in the Southwest, the law seems to have created a lot of confusion and difficulty for those who are supposed to benefit from these regulations. For example, there are no related concepts in many Native American languages for some of the key words in the law. Words like ownership, patrimony, affiliation, associated and unassociated funerary objects, and rights of alienation are virtually unknown.
But if you talk to traditional community people, and I think very few would know the word NAGPRA, very few would understand its implications involving their cultural resources.
Cultural affiliation, I think, is one thing that is at a point where it needs to be discussed a little further, and I just hope it does not get into anything like a legal bind. It has created controversy among the Athabascan and the Pueblonian groups, and I think this matter is a very sensitive issue.
Because of oral history and ceremonies that came from places like Canyon de Chelly, Chaco, and Mesa Verde, and for this reason, we take cultural affiliation very seriously. Being a Navajo, and I've talked to a lot of other Navajos, we do not believe in the Bering Strait theory that we've been here, we've always been here.
NAGPRA, while well intended, has created also some very unique problems for the Hopi people. So today, as we now get into the politics of cultural affiliation, I'm very interested in having research deal with, again, non-sensitive collections such as pottery sherds around research themes that the Hopi tribe can benefit from. Pottery sherds can indeed help the Hopi people, because in our migration traditions, there were some very specific traditions and teachings that, along with how we migrated throughout what we now know as our ancestral homeland. One, the shattering of pots was very deliberate, because one day we were told those footprints will become very important for the Hopi people. Hopi say if but one pottery sherd remains at a site, it will still tell a story.
Even when a word is known, the understanding of it may be completely different. The term sacred, for example, has a different meaning for a non-Indian than for a Native American. Non-Indians frequently ask, is that site more sacred than the one over there? Which is the most sacred part? Or is this object more sacred than another object? To a southwestern Indian, the entire universe is sacred, with no part being more sacred than another part. All things natural or created for religious use are sacred, no matter how small or insignificant they may seem to others. Everything is sacred. This worldview is the very essence of southwestern Indian spiritual life and power.
Reclaiming human remains has created a difficult and oftentimes emotional situation for southwestern tribes. That's because some are having to create new systems, possibly new rituals for reburial, something they've never had to do before. Among the Pueblos, Navajos, and Apaches, death and burial ceremonies are private and clan associated. After prayers are said, the spirit of the dead person is sent off forever. So to remind someone of the dead by returning bones and other human remains desecrated by removal is unheard of. That is, until NAGPRA came along. Here in the Southwest, Indian people believe that returning human remains could create a spiritual danger and a difficulty for the living. So what you'll find is that Pueblos, Apaches, and Navajos may be reluctant to reclaim human remains from museum collections.
In history, where many times there was conflict with some of the nomadic warring groups where raiding took place, and of course in these conflicts lives were lost, and so in the Zuni view, to bring in the remains of the enemy may have negative ramifications. The Zuni tribe also feels too that if we do bring in remains, that we do not have a ceremony to return them to the Mother Earth. The funerary rite is something that is very private, and it is a sad event. There's much ritual and obligation, fasting that is involved, and so at this point to make a connection with a human remain to a family or a group, it would be quite difficult, and to have a family or a group to take on, the fasting obligation, the ritual, it is something that is of very serious nature, and most likely no Zuni family or group would come forth to do this.
Growing up in a traditional world or traditional way of life, and working with NAGPRA and working for the Historic Preservation Department, as far as working with sacred bundles and sacred objects and items of cultural patrimony, it's been consistent. We haven't had any problems. But like I said, when we get to human remains, and then that causes a big problem for traditional people such as myself.
Whomever has these human remains, that it is now in their possession. It is their responsibility to manage and care for them, and that will hold them to that until the time becomes that we can work together to take our human remains out of their possession and get them reburied at home.
In the Southwest, tribal, civil, and religious leadership are usually two separate entities. Repatriation of human remains and sacred or ceremonial objects involves decision-making by both groups. Usually all NAGPRA matters are channeled through the elected or appointed tribal officials and then to the religious leaders. The religious leaders, in consultation with the appropriate tribal elders, decide on the matter and inform the governor and council, who then convey the decisions to the museums. This is not always the case, however. Although they share elements of a common history and culture, each pueblo and tribe's civil and religious structures have evolved independently. Frequent changes in leadership also create problems and delays in the NAGPRA decision-making process. 15 tribes have annual administrative turnovers. Some have elections every 2 years, and one group elects leaders for 4 years. In some groups, civil officials are appointed by the religious leaders and/or elders, and in some, they are elected. Each new group of officials must come to grips with a complex set of problems resulting from the NAGPRA legislation. One of those problems is limited resources. A few tribes, like the Zunis, the Hopis, and the Navajos, do have historic preservation programs, but a majority of the tribes don't have the money to hire staff or tribal members to read through NAGPRA inventories. They also don't have the money to travel to view museum collections or private consultation. And even if a tribe did have the money, many tribal groups don't have the knowledge or the expertise to evaluate museum collections or inventories. Many of those inventories are computer printouts from different databases, and making sense of the different formats and the archaeological jargon can be a challenge.
We don't have the resources like these other tribes do. Like, we don't have a cultural preservation office, or we don't have a historic preservation office, or we don't have, how would I say, we don't have tribal codes or resolutions or things like that say, okay, this is the way you should deal with this issue. This is the way you should deal with the inventorying of funeral remains and things like that.
One of the biggest challenges that I see is that in our visitations to various museums, the East Coast, California, museums here in New Mexico, Arizona. I found that there are so many sacred items that are in the collections, and so for us that creates a very big task. I know that it is said that we do not really have any deadline as far as taking that next step once we've identified these sacred objects and fitting our category for repatriation. Now the matter is to actually physically have these sacred items be returned back to Zuni. That is just looking at the numbers, it goes into the thousands.
There is a night-way ceremony dish up at the Field Museum in Chicago that was on display a couple years ago, and through consultation work with the Field Museum and us, we were successful of taking it off display and storing it in their storage space the proper way. And we wanted to get it back, and we found out that it was treated back in the early 1900s with arsenic. And this causes a problem for the items and us, because we like to, like I said, bring it back and put it back into use, which in this case we can't. So we have to consult with our Hatchali advisory members and see what we can do about that.
When dealing with Native communities in the Southwest, it is important to realize that even such apparently clear terms as elders may have a different meaning than in English. A religious elder is not necessarily an older person. The terms and what they mean may vary from tribe to tribe. NAGPRA must also be understood within the many more immediate demands on the communities, such as healthcare, housing, education, and resolving the legal problems surrounding Indian gaming. Lack of a quick response to the NAGPRA inventories doesn't mean there is a lack of interest. It may mean there is a lack of resources. There is no time limit for tribes to respond to the inventories. It's important to remember that each tribe will deal with the problems posed by NAGPRA differently. One tribe may choose to repatriate, another may decide not to, and that's exactly what has happened so far. At the Museum of New Mexico, we are currently working closely with local Indian communities to determine how to proceed with the NAGPRA process. We have developed a collaborative approach based on working with individual partners from 7 tribes. The partners are tribal members appointed to the project by the tribal governor and/or religious leaders. The partners work closely with museum staff in processing archaeological materials from their tribal lands. They are able to identify items in the collections requiring special curatorial care. For example, as a result of the partner from Acama's recommendation, human remains and their associated funerary objects are now stored in the same box instead of being separated. The partners also learn about museum practices, archaeology, and record keeping, and are now able to convey this information back to the tribe and religious elders. Thus, the partners can assist their tribes in the evaluations of inventories from other museums and provide some degree of continuity as tribal administrations change. At the tribal level, the partners have no decision-making powers. They serve as liaison people between the tribe and the museum. The Partners program has been supported by 2 grants from the National Park Service.
I don't see the museum community really as an adversary at all today, but rather as a resource that really should be available to the Hopi people. So I'm interested in having our own archaeologists. I'm interested in having our own Hopis trained as cultural anthropologists. I'm interested in having our own tribal historians, and I'm interested in having our own archivists, Hopis trained. And that's where, again, the Hopi tribe, I believe, is reaching out to the museum community to go forward with, again, this challenge of partnering or partnerships, because I think beyond the emotion and politics that maybe NAGPRA has caused, I think NAGPRA has also provided a very significant opportunity for tribal and institutional collaboration.
And I think to some extent there's a certain amount of trust that they're being well taken care of here in the interim until the time that we can actually effect their burial.
What I like to see is hopefully in the future with other museums and institutions is that number one is to consult with the tribes in reference to any of their collections which they house, and also giving tribes the opportunity to have input and make recommendations openly and have that respect. I know that Museum of New Mexico has always played that important role.
Even though many tribes here in the Southwest share a common worldview, you must understand that each tribe has evolved differently. There are many philosophical differences between tribes here in the Southwest, and you must realize that one tribe or one individual cannot speak for another group.
A little background on this is that when an individual has come to the end of their life on this earth, they are put into the Mother Earth to begin their spirit journey, and that this, in the Zuni view, is only done once. And with the remains that are now in museum collections, institutions, and sometimes private collections, it is felt that these remains should rightfully be returned to the Mother Earth. But as far as repatriating remains that have been excavated from Zuni homelands, right now the Zuni tribe is not pursuing this, and this, as I said, is for cultural reasons. But that does not say that we are not concerned. We are very concerned with the remains that are in collections, wherever they may be, museums, institutions, or even sometimes private collections. We have been involved, and we will be continue to involve ourselves in the discussions to as far as the disposition of these remains.
Our policy is unwritten, yet we have ways, and we insist that it's like an unwritten principle that we have every intentions to have our human remains reburied, so that our peoples who were removed from places on Acoma land, even though we may not have a written policy on how they should be treated here or how they should be repatriated back to Acoma, that is our goal, to get them back and reburied.
As far as human remains, we're working with the Pittsburgh Midway mining company that we're going to try to exchange some land for some of these remains so they can go back into the ground if we do repatriate human remains from museums and institutions across the country.
Among the key questions that we asked more recently in our resolution is really putting the burden on museums, and for that matter, the federal government, on collections taken from Hopi in many cases under legal auspices, like under a Antiquities Act permit, on everything that was taken from the Hopi reservation that subsequently was traded, exchanged, or sold to foreign museums. The Hopi tribe has made it clear that it still has a legal and cultural interest in that property, and our resolution seeks to find a partnership beyond the adversarial kind of relationship, a partnership with museums to again deal with this very important question. I encourage museums to administratively deal with some of the requests that the Hopi tribe has made, particularly how to collaborate again with the Hopi people to ensure that privileged and esoteric information that the Hopi tribe is worried about being in public domain can be better managed.
No doubt you've heard the term, one size fits all. Well, that's exactly what NAGPRA is trying to do. The government's attempts to make one set of regulations fit all has created serious misunderstandings, stress, and confusion about the repatriation of religious and ceremonial objects and human remains. Many tribes here in the Southwest feel strongly that those objects should have never been removed or collected from tribal lands in the first place. Pueblos, Apaches, and Navajos want museums to know that they are not dead cultures, but are viable and ongoing. The collection of sacred objects and human remains has been going on for about a century. Repatriation may take many years, perhaps even decades, to carry out. We hope that what you've learned from this video is to speak to each tribe directly, with openness, understanding, and with respect.
By educating, for instance, museum personnel or boards of governing boards, I think that's one way of convincing people that it is important to have these items returned, and that's how we've been basically approaching it, is through open dialogue. And of course, this does not happen overnight. Sometimes we've had to negotiate and work on these matters, and it takes years.
Sometimes we do, in fact, go into a situation with both guns blazing, but we ultimately come out of the saloon with our guns in our holsters, you know.
I want to work with the museum to repatriate our ancestors and our belongings, because I want my children to have a culture in which to grow up.